I really thank the organizers for allowing me this opportunity to introduce you to identity economics and to inequality, which of course you may know already some of this, but to have a chance to talk to you. And I very much look forward to the presentations that I'll be attending on Thursday afternoon, your time. So again, thanks very much. Thanks to whoever's organizing on the screen. I really appreciate this. Yay, that's right. Okay, so let me introduce, why are we studying inequality? Okay, we all showed up at the summer school, so why do we think inequality is an important subject for us to be studying? So I'm going to be really, what's the word? Very, very simple here. What is inequality? Some people have more of whatever it is we're measuring, and some people have less. Okay, so that's inequality. So again, why do we care? Why are we studying inequality? Well, as social scientists or economists, we're always curious about the world. And so we might want to describe such patterns. We might want to understand why some people have more and some people have less. It's an interesting phenomenon. But why do we concentrate on inequality as a pattern of interest? Because there's many patterns out there in our social and economic world which could be of interest to us. So why inequality per se? Well, as economists, we might think that inequality is somehow bad for growth or economic development. So if there's a very skewed income distribution, that may be bad for growth. So if we have just an economic objective in our heads, we may think, well, we should understand inequality because inequality is bad for growth. And of course, that is one reason why we study inequality. Another reason I think a lot of us study inequality is because we somehow think this inequality, this pattern we see, is somehow unfair or unjust. Why is it that some people have more, some people have less? It doesn't seem right, right? And so we somehow have another interest in mind when we're studying inequality. And I think particularly many of us feel that inequality is unjust or unfair when inequality is associated with social difference. So it's not that just some people have more and some people have less, and that's some random distribution across any particular economy. Inequality is actually, as we all know, can be somewhat systematic. Within the society, certain social groups have more and certain social groups have less of whatever it is we're trying to measure. So some examples, inequality is not sort of somehow randomly distributed within an economy. So just some examples. In the United States, of course, we know that the inequality, the income distribution skews towards white Americans having more income and wealth than Black Americans or Hispanic Americans. In Europe, we know that Europeans of North African or African origin or Roma origin would tend to have less income, less access to education, worse housing, et cetera, than other Europeans. And in many parts of the world, in fact, I would say in most parts of the world, women actually have lower income and less opportunities than men. So when we start to think about why inequality is a pattern of interest for us to study, I think we can't separate, or at least I'm going to argue, that we shouldn't separate that inequality is not randomly distributed within a society, but that it is related to particular other social patterns of ethnicity and of social difference. So of course, that's where identity comes in, right? Identity is a way to understand and a way to start to model social difference. So that's where identity and inequality come together, because we're trying to understand social difference and patterns of inequality. Okay, so let's just take a sense of what I mean by social difference, by identity. At a minimum, identity is simply a designator of a social group. So as I just said, I can talk about Blacks, whites, Roma, North Africans, et cetera, or women, right? Just a designator of people that have different characteristics, racial, ethnic, gender characteristics. That's at a minimum what it does. But how does identity figure into inequality? Is it simply a descriptor, as I just said? So we just, we just describe people in this particular way, and we see these patterns, and we say, oh, that's an interesting pattern. Or is identity and these social groupings part of the processes and structures that create and sustain inequality. And so that's what I'm going to, of course, talk about, is that identity is not just a mere descriptor of different people, but identity and the concept of identity in economics, which I'm going to elaborate for you, can be part of the processes and structures that create and sustain inequality. And so that's why we should, again, be, when we look at inequality, we should be also trying to understand identity. Okay, so let's dig a little bit deeper into what we mean by identity and how we understand it. So again, what is identity? The way we're, in a very simple way of talking about it, identity is a person's sense of self or a person's self-image. Okay, but it's also how a person views him or herself and how others view him or her. So it's both how I see myself and how others see me. And you might think that could be absent the social group in which I am, right? Or it can be attached to those social groupings. So identity, as I said before, could be used as a descriptor. So in the United States, you might say I am Hispanic, or in other places, one might say I'm Hispanic. But identity is also used as a way of describing feelings or emotions of individuals. So I'm going to later attach these feelings and emotions to utility and utility functions, as though feelings and emotions attached to the way I feel. So I might say, I have a strong sense of identity. I feel really good about myself. I'm proud to be an Hispanic. So by the way, given the images on the screen that we're all watching, if you're watching the Euro, I bet a lot of you are watching the football tournament that's happening right now. Wow. Okay. It's just stunning to see the attachment that people have to their different countries. And, I mean, it's just, it's really, again, watch these football games with a new lens. I guess there's no games tonight, the next round coming up. So you have a strong sense of identity, you feel good about yourself, but you also feel good about yourself as you're attached to these different social groups. So how I feel about myself depends on the ideals or the norms a person holds for oneself and how other people hold for that person. So how a person of a particular heritage or a particular gender should be acting or behaving. So if I feel good about myself, the myself is sort of as a person who is of a particular gender, of a particular ethnicity, that I'm acting according to what's expected of me, not only by myself, but perhaps my family and friends and the wider society. So you might say, I am proud to be Hispanic. And so, of course, this judgment depends on originally sort of how Hispanic I feel and whether I and myself am living up to whatever ideals are, living up to those norms and ideals. So I have another thing to recommend to you. In the Heights is a movie that just came out in the United States. It's about Washington Heights, which is just north, in the north part of Manhattan. Again, you can see all of this on display. It's a Hispanic neighborhood. Okay. So what we want to do, to develop this notion of identity, George Akerlof, who's my co-author in a lot of this work, in the original work, we spent a lot of time reading about identity in other disciplines. So identity is not a concept that we created, by no means, of course. It's something that is well established in social psychology and in anthropology and sociology and history, basically every place else but economics. And so what we tried to do is incorporate these notions of identity into a utility function, because that's how we work, right? We work as economists with these models, which I'm going to elaborate for you, utility functions. And so the way we're going to do this, and I'll do this, you'll see as we get into the talk, I'm sort of get deeper and deeper into notation and examples and so on. I'm just trying to warm us up, and it's going to go through layers as we go through the talk. So we're going to build a payoff function or utility function where individuals have preferences over their own and others' actions, which the utility depends on the people's identity and the norms for those categories. So the building blocks, what's going to be different about our utility function are the social categories and the norms that are associated with those categories. And then we're going to talk about how people are abiding or not by the norms for their categories. So individuals will care about their own actions depending on their identity, the extent to which their actions abide by the norms for who they are, for their identity. So utility is enhanced when you abide by your own norms. But individuals also care about others' actions. So these are these externalities. So people may suffer a utility loss. You may be offended, right? When somebody is violating, say, gender norms, like a man's not supposed to act like that. And so, I'm going to punish you, right? Or disassociate with somebody who's acting in a way which for you seems strange, given to how you think they should be acting. And of course, there's retaliation against people who break the norms. And so people may retaliate against those who break the norms. And that may be at a cost, but it somehow makes persons feel better by restoring the norms that are in place. Okay, so I just sort of gave you a sort of a vague, but will become more precise outline of what a model with identity is going to include. And most importantly, again, it has to have the social categories and the norms associated with those categories. So for example, men and women, which are the categories, and the norms associated with men and women, what it means to be a man, what it means to be a woman, perhaps in a different country or different social context. So why do we want such a model? What is such a model going to do for us? So when we add identity to an economic framework, as you will see, I hope I'll convince you throughout the lecture, that when individuals make choices and interact strategically, when utility depends on these identities and the norms for a category, we're going to see patterns of behavior. Remember, patterns as in inequality, right? A pattern of behavior or an economic outcome. And in particular, the model might be able to explain, an identity model might be explain patterns that cannot be explained with a standard model, or perhaps are uncomfortably explained by a standard model. So any economic theorist can write down a model to capture a phenomenon or a pattern. The question is sort of how convoluted is the model? And our argument is that a model with identity can give very straightforward explanations about certain patterns that other models can't. And these models will then match with certain empirical realities. And of course, why do we want to do that? Because that will give us a new understanding as to these patterns and different policy prescriptions. So if we don't get the model right, then we won't know how to address the issue. So the argument is adding identity to models will help us get the model right, which then will give us some policy insights. Okay. So what I want to do for the rest, that was a sort of a global introduction. What I'd like to do precisely is first give a discussion of identity and inequality, which is part one, which is theory. And what I'm going to do is give an overview of theoretical approaches to social norms and social difference. So again, George Akerlof and I were not the first ones to also see that social norms are important in economic behavior. Right. So social norms have been studied by other economists, but I want to outline for you what identity is, which is distinct from other models of social norms. So you'll be able to see, when you see the word social norms, you might be able to see, sort of which type of model or which type of theoretical construct people are using. So a standard model, as I'll elaborate a little bit later, has basically people have preferences, and they face constraints, and then they make decisions. So I like apples or I like oranges. I have a budget constraint, and I go out and I buy apples and oranges. So you have preferences over different actions, subject to constraints, that makes your decision. A model with strategic interaction, a model with strategic interaction will include other people. So that might be distinct from a standard model. We start to bring in strategic interaction. We start to bring in other people who are acting strategically with each other. So I have preferences over when you do something, it affects me. So therefore, we may interact strategically. But that's, again, how I feel, or the utility I get from what you do is just based on my preferences. Okay. Identity economics is a new approach where the preferences, where we start to work with those preferences. And those preferences are built on these building blocks of, again, social categories and the norms associated with those categories. When I go through this theory, I'm going to use human capital acquisition, which is the way we describe schooling, right? So this is people going to school and gaining human capital. So I'm going to go through human capital acquisition As an example, first, just outline a standard model, do some strategic interaction very lightly, and then give you a bit more guts of what an identity model looks like. So you can see the distinction between those theoretical approaches. And of course, I'm picking human capital acquisition as the example because human capital is key to getting jobs, right? And therefore, and success in the labor market, and therefore related to inequality, right? So we know that different access to education and different education attainment very much affects people's ultimate economic earnings and their wealth. So then we'll see sort of a way that identity through human capital acquisition can give us a window on patterns of inequality. I'm also going to give a quick example of identity and redistribution, where redistribution here is a political redistribution. I'm just going to give you a sense of someone else's model and how they used identity in such a case. The second part of my lectures is going to concern experiments. And so theory and experiments. Here, the question is, do we see evidence, empirical evidence, and specifically experimental evidence for the impact of identity on behavior? So not only do I sort of watch the Euro and say, my gosh, there's clear impact of identity on behavior when I watch these football games, but can I systematically identify, right, in a rigorous way, using the methods that we love, right, where we have, say, a particular experimental intervention, see the impact of identity on people's choices. So I'm going to go through some experiments that do indeed identify the impact of identity on people's choices. So these experiments typically have a variation in identity. So we're going to somehow manipulate people's identity in the laboratory and see how they behave. And one of the questions that we're going to ask as we do those exercises, do people have actually preferences for inequality? Okay, so let's just sit with that for a second. We started with the idea that inequality is some people have more, some people have less, right? And we said somehow, we think that is an interesting pattern to study, and it's interesting, and we also think we should study it because it reflects these different social groups, and there seems to be something unfair, unjust about these patterns. And so this is just a really, really, really basic question. Do people actually want there to be inequality? And the answer is, I'm going to show you yes. Experimentally, we can show there are people out there who like inequality. They are not inequity averse or inequality averse, like some of, like we know, and we know we've seen some experiments show that, but I'm going to show you people who are rather robustly like situations of inequality. Of course, they like to be the person with the more money, not the less money. They want to be the person who has more money. Okay. All right. So before I launch into the first part, are there any questions? No. So I can't, is there a chat that's going on? I can't tell. If there is a chat, Alana, you will sort of relay any, because I can't see a chat. I can't do all those things.
There is a chat. There's nothing in it yet.
Okay, great. So if there is something, just let me know. I can't do that too. That's too many things on my screen. Even after a year and 3 months of doing this, I cannot handle a screen, pictures, and a chat. All right. So let's launch into the inequality, the theory part. All right. So again, now here's another basic question: is why theory? Why should we? Why do we need theory at all? And I'm going to give you an argument why we want some theory. We know that in empirical work, putting identity or social category markers is standard practice in the empirical study of socioeconomic outcomes. So first, looking at a study of inequality, we're going to put in things like Black, female, ethnicity, region, state, and so forth. And we also might do interaction effects, so Black females, for example. And in these empirical exercises, this is, in some sense, a bit of a black box. So we know that there are these, again, going back, inequality has these patterns that relate to social groupings. We can tell that in our empirical work, but we don't really know why. And if we don't know why, then we won't be able to, introduce any sort of policy recommendations and so on. So I'm going to start introducing my human capital acquisition example. So let's consider education or human capital acquisition, right? So there's a child or adolescent who underachieves in school. And what we mean by underachieving is this child is not getting the education that would be predicted by the benefits and costs from education. So we can go out there and we can say, well, somebody with a college degree earns X, right? And the presumed cost of education is Y, and this person is getting, less education than would be predicted by those benefits or costs. So we certainly know, I can give you some categories of children or adolescents who, quote unquote, underachieve in school, who do not get the level that would be predicted. So obviously Black children in the United States, Roma children in Hungary, girls in many, many, many places in developing countries. All right, so if that's the pattern we see, why do we need theory to help us understand that pattern? Well, there's many explanations for this underachievement. And so we want to be able to systematically describe why this pattern is there that we're picking up in the data. And if we don't know why the pattern's there, we won't be able to address the patterns if, again, we think those patterns are important to address. So what can account for the empirical findings and those interaction effects? So the theory is to unpack that black box of the effects. Of course, there's many ways to do so. So I'm going to give you a general overview of the way theory might approach such an empirical pattern. So what would a basic economic model do? As I sort of mentioned earlier, a basic economic model would have individuals have utility over from their own choices or actions. So individuals have preferences, right? And these preferences over schooling, for example, and over income or consumption. And these preferences are usually understood to be idiosyncratic. So people wake up one day and they have these preferences and they're exogenous. And then there's some sort of technology, or we might call that constraints, and people make a decision based on they're maximizing the utility. They have which the utility, of course, is capturing these preferences, subject to the constraints that are facing them. And the choices lead to patterns of behavior. Okay. A strategic interaction model. Individuals will have payoffs from their own and others' actions, and they still have idiosyncratic costs and benefits, which are presumed to be exogenous. But we're introducing a game form or institutions which specify the information asymmetries that might be at play. Okay, I'm going to illustrate all of these with education in a minute. The equilibria of these of the strategic interaction gives the patterns of behavior. So here it's choices give patterns of behavior, and here with strategic interaction will be the equilibria give patterns of behavior. In all of the above, however, you notice that preferences are really key, right? The preferences that go into the basic model and the costs and benefits that go into the strategic model, these preferences are determining the utilities and the payoffs. So what are these preferences? Well, preferences in sort of a very standard economics is what a person likes or doesn't like. So this might go back to Becker. You like apples and oranges, you like going to school or not. In the identity model, preferences are going to be much richer. Preferences are going to be not what somebody likes necessarily, but what they should or shouldn't do. So instead of just having a notion, I like something or I don't like something, there's also a notion of this is what I should do or what I shouldn't do, and this is what other people should do or shouldn't do. So it's a richer notion of preferences. And with this richer notion, again, this richer notion will be combined with social categories. You combine those with the technology and constraints and the strategic interaction to give patterns of behavior. So the choices and the equilibria, so choices, equilibria, give patterns of behavior, right? But a key ingredient is this enriched notion of preferences. Okay. Okay, so now let's do schooling. Okay, so let's do the standard model. So basic economic model. Okay, so the utility function, there's an individual with exogenous idiosyncratic preferences, and they're going to make choices given the technology and constraints. So what would this look like? There's a child. The child likes or doesn't like school or studying, right? Or maybe is more or less talented at schoolwork. So they find schoolwork more or less difficult. So this is just something that's exogenous to the kid. The kid wakes up one day and somehow likes or doesn't like school, or is more or less talented at schoolwork. This child weighs the costs and benefits of schooling, given the quality of the school and the opportunity cost of attending school, the job networks that are available, which determine the benefits of going to school, or perhaps the discrimination that this child might face on the job market. So we have both the cost, so the costs and benefits of the school. So we can write those down in a sort of a standard way. All right. And so we could use this model to explain the pattern. Remember the patterns that I had earlier, which are that some people underachieve in school despite what we think. So maybe Blacks in the United States, for example, have lower levels of academic achievements because they attend worse schools and have worse job networks. So it could be that an input to education. So when I study, right, the returns to my studying in terms of the skills that I'll use in the job market has to depend on the quality of this, depends on the quality of school that I attend, right? So if my school is lousy, then relative to somebody who attends a really good school, I'm going to, exert less effort in school and obtain less human capital. Perfectly reasonable explanation of an empirical pattern that a particular group of people has lower levels of academic achievement. For girls, we could do a similar kind of model. Girls have lower levels of academic achievement because they have high opportunity cost of time. So if we were to look at, say, girls and say, why do girls have lower levels of schooling? Well, it could be because the opportunity cost of their time spent on school is actually very high. They're expected to be, working in the home, for example. Okay. Now, I hope you recognize that I slipped in there some things. So first, I should say that this model is useful because indeed there could be such technology and such constraints which are facing people, right? But it begs the question of why Blacks attend worse schools. Why are the schools for Blacks lower quality with teachers that aren't as well prepared, for example? And why is it that women should attend to household chores? So we said, yeah, girls have this higher opportunity cost of time, but why? Okay. We haven't answered that question. And we also haven't answered why there might be discrimination on the labor market. So none of those questions, none of those ingredients of the model, which gave us our pattern, are explained by the model itself, right? So we can put these ingredients in the model, but we have not explained the root, which is that the opportunity cost of attending school might be different for different people of different social categories, right? So girls versus boys. Why the technology that is facing people when they're making these decisions might be different. So Blacks versus whites, or Romas versus non-Roma. So this pushes the inequality assumption to what is behind the assumptions in these basic models. Okay. So that's what the basic model does, and a bit of a critique as to what they, I guess like a bit of a plug for what they answer, but what also they don't answer. Now let's do I'm just going to give you sort of an outline of a strategic interaction model. So again, in a model with strategic interactions, individual payoffs depend on own preferences and others' actions, or preferences over other people's actions. People make choices strategically, taking into account how others may be reacting, and equilibria give us some sort of social pattern. So if we were to take a repeated game as an example of strategic interaction, a strategic game can produce what's called a social norm. So there's an equilibrium action, which people are supposed to be taking, and people punish those who violate the equilibrium action, as we can sustain an equilibrium, as we know by the Folks theorem, pretty much anything, right? And this equilibrium could involve a bad social norm. So it could be that everybody is, as I'll show you in a second, the girls are getting lower levels of education as an equilibrium of a repeated game. So what would that look like? Oh, I'll get to that in a second. I forgot. There's one other game I wanted to tell you about. Another kind of game is a signaling game, where the actions indicate an underlying observed attribute, and the equilibrium is also viewed as a social norm. that people are sort of signaling something about themselves, and we can call that a social norm. So a signal is sometimes sort of understood as a norm. So in both a repeated game and signaling games, people sort of label the equilibrium, oh, look, I found a social norm. So if you add labels to the equilibria, then you have a theory about a social outcome. So let me give you some examples. So of the repeated game kind of example, you might, you could easily, as we all know, build a repeated game model where girls will invest less in school because they do not want to have bad marriage prospects. So the idea here is that girls who get too much schooling will not be able to find a husband. And why aren't they able to find a husband? Because the family of that man is not going to accept her. And why is the family of that man not going to accept her? So that's this punishment. People who violate the equilibrium action. The family of that, the larger family of that family is not going to accept them. So you have this infinite regress of punishments which sustain this lower level of education. Okay. That's similar to this. I should jump to this bottom bullet point. There's, Blacks might not be hired by firms to avoid boycott by consumers. So, so again, that's another example of a game that you can do this infinite regress of punishment where you have the initial actor not taking an action which violates some sort of social norm because they fear they will be punished. And then if they don't punish, somebody will punish, et cetera, et cetera. So again, this punishment that leads to this equilibrium where people are doing something that's suboptimal. For a signaling game, there's this paper that shows that Black children, the argument is Black children might achieve less in school in order to signal that they're more sociable types. So you have a dual audience problem. You have a firm that is interested in hiring workers, and you have a peer group which is interested in people hanging out. But you have one action in the model that the decision maker can take, which is to achieve more or less in school. And so a person or an actor in this model might choose to invest less in school in order to signal to the peer group that they're a more sociable type. So the underlying type is a sociable or unsociable type. So it's a basic signaling model, but now you have two audiences, one signal. Okay, so these are different ways in which you can build a social norm through a model of strategic interaction. So in those models, which I just outlined for you, inequality is somehow the capricious outcome of the social interaction. There's no really deep social context per se in what I did, what I just described to you. So for example, the one I just told you about this signal, there's actually really nothing in the model that says that was about African-American kids. It could be about any kid and any peer group, right? So in order for it to be about African-American kids, I have to add something about why, for example, African-American kids value peer groups more than other kids. So that could easily apply. There's nothing in the model which says that, that wouldn't be a model of white kids. White kids like friends too, right? So there's nothing particularly meaningful in any of these models about the social group that is about which the model is trying to explain. Okay. So I don't mean to say that these strategic models aren't useful. I do think that social norms out there may be these bad equilibria, right? So we could be stuck in this bad equilibria. And if that is the case, then intervention is needed to change the equilibria. So some people argue that the US civil rights law, which was about the firms not hiring Blacks, was actually an intervention which changed a bad equilibrium. So I don't mean to dismiss this. I've written models. I've written, papers like this too, right? So everything should be, every tool that we have in our toolkit should be used and used appropriately. Question is are we explaining what we think we're explaining? So I'd like to consider 3 points that the models which I've just outlined for you, the basic economic model, as well as the model with strategic interaction, what I think they're lacking, or the possible problems. One is the theoretical requirements to sustain the equilibria are very strong. So if you actually write down these models and you see what sustains these equilibria with these bad social norms, it's actually quite a lot of machinery you need. And you need like these punishments to be ad infinitum, right? But more than the theoretical, I'd say theoretical requirements. If we just wake up and kind of stop looking at our economic papers and look at the world out there, everything I just was talking about, and basically every single category that I mentioned already on the slides, plus many more, they're associated with norms. Huge amount of discussions in the literature, in the press, activists, there's legal innovation, all about what is appropriate and inappropriate behavior. So what does marriage mean anyway, for example? What does it mean to be a married person? What does it mean to be a mother? What does it mean to be a father? What does it mean to be a man? What does it mean to be a woman? What does it mean to be a person of a particular ethnicity in a particular context? What does it mean to be a good, fill in the blank, right? And we know that that's not neutral. It's not that everybody agrees. We know that there's battles over that. We know that people die over these issues, right? So a model which says, oh, we're going to have this little signaling game, which can be people. I think signaling is a real phenomenon, right? But we don't want to stop there, because we know that the battles that we see out there in the world are over precisely the social categories themselves, right? And the norms associated with those categories. And we also know that they've changed drastically over time, right? So we can look at, gender norms are kind of like the most obvious example. What it means to be a woman and what it means to be a man, and what does masculinity mean and what does femininity mean, are contested. And they've been contested not just now, they've been contested for a very, very long time. And we've seen these changes over time. By the way, if you want a really nice example of that, next time if you're watching the Euro now, next time watch the Women's World Cup in soccer. Okay, it's also football, but we call it soccer in the United States. Watch the Women's World Cup in football and guess who the dominant team is. Okay, somebody put it in the chat. You must know. Somebody gave the answer? Yes, exactly. Okay, so where does the US rank internationally in the men's team? Okay, I don't know if we don't want to put down the number, right? It's pretty low, right? They're hardly ever qualifying for the World Cup. So that's, I know it's kind of fun to talk about this because it's football and everything like that, but this is just a really, really striking example of a difference in gender norms, right? So American women play soccer and they're really good at it. So I've seen some more chat. No, I'm actually might be able to see what's the other people. Top 40, nowhere. Yeah. Okay. Yes, I know that. I watched the final. So they beat Mexico. So, and it was really kind of striking, of course. And so now that I have you all, go look up the women's American team. And of course, and by the way, they're fighting for equal pay. It's another part of what they're trying to do. So that's, it's fun and games. We can talk about football, but this is real issues, right? Is that the notion of what's appropriate, what's inappropriate, what people are allowed to do, what we say, people fight for these issues, people march for these issues, people petition governments, people bring lawsuits, and all of that activity, and dare I say, economic activity, is something that we should be cognizant of, right? And so that we need to be aware that these issues are deep, and we need to bring them in some way into our models. Okay, all right. So with that plug, I will now give you, I need to go back here. All right, so let's go to preferences and identity. So preferences and norms, okay, what people are fighting over are also possible sources of inequalities. So Becker, Gary Becker, has this wonderful model where he has a taste-based theory of discrimination. You probably know this work. So in the same way that people like apples and oranges, some people like apples, and some people like oranges, maybe some people don't want to work with Black co-workers or women. So it's just a taste. Worker with these tastes would require a wage premium. And so blacks and women would then have lower benefits of education. And we know that in this model, competition among the firms would eventually eliminate these high-cost firms that have to pay this wage premium. So again, we're not the first people to see that preferences, right, and norms are possible sources of inequality, right? So it goes way back to Becker. So we can see that, preferences per se, just preferences per se can matter to inequality. And so what George Akerlof and I are bringing in, as I said before, preferences involve both these likes. I like apples and I like oranges, but also I should like apples and I should like oranges. Of course, that sounds silly about apples and oranges, but it doesn't necessarily sound silly when we talk about things, about other food choices, about should you buy meat? I bet your generation would have a different answer than your parents' generation or my parents' generation or my grandparents' generation, which is that these preferences are not necessarily idiosyncratic. It's not like some people like meat and other people don't, or taught. We're told, right? We're taught whether or not it's appropriate or not appropriate to be making certain purchases, right? And those preferences will depend on people's social identities. And these, again, as I said before, these identity-based preferences, they're not neutral, they are contested. So we're trying to build a model where individuals think of themselves and others more or less consciously in terms of social categories. So again, people have tastes, but also norms about how people should behave. So people will have a utility from their own actions and other actions. People internalize this norm and they may punish people who violate the social code. So what I want to do now is I'm going to build this utility function. Okay, so I'm going to build this utility function, and then I'm going to give you now some actual equations and study schooling and minority poverty. Okay, are we all ready to go? So now we're going to start having notation and things like that. All right, so let's start with the standard model of utility. A standard model of utility might be something like the utility of person J is some function W, and it's a function of AJ, which is J's actions, and A not J, which is other people's actions. Now, the inclusion of AJ captures the possibility of externalities or strategic interactions, right? So this could be, like how much I study in school and how much you study in school, and that may determine my utility, right? Because there could be complementarity, say, between how much we study in school. Okay, so this is completely standard. Oh, there I have it. So AJ is the effort of J in school, and A not J is the effort of others in school, which may or may not hurt J's academic achievement. Okay, so now let's add identity ingredients. So an identity model will have the following ingredients. First is we need a set of social categories. And we need, second, individual J's assignment of self and others to those categories. So you have a set of social categories, for example, men, women, and then you divide the population into men and women. Third ingredient, the norms. The norms give the appropriate behavior and ideal attributes of each social category. So the norms are going to say what each person in each category should do and what they should look like, or some sort of attribute about them, right? Which is ideal for that category. The utility function then is an expanded utility function. It's now some function U, and it has in it own actions and other actions. And now we have this identity piece, IJ, which is J's self-image. And IJ, I'm going to put this up on the next slide in a second. So IJ, a person's identity, is going to depend on these things. Okay, so I'm going to do it on the next slide, but see, IJ is now part of somebody's utility. So before we just had WJ and we only had AJ and A not, but now I've got a new ingredient in people's utility. Epsilon J is J's given attributes. So I've got this now up here so we can dissect this. So this is the utility function. Depends on own actions, other people's actions, and individual J's identity. And individual J's identity depends on own actions, other actions, as follows. So overall utility depends on the actions as they affect economic utility and how they affect the self-image IJ. Okay, so the actions come in two places. One is the economic outcome, and the other is the identity outcome. And the self-image, this identity depends on acting as one should. So this is the match between the actions and the category norms, okay? Fitting in is the match between a person's individual attributes and the ideal of the category specified by N, okay? That's the other ingredient we're going to have in our identity function. And the status, perhaps there's an overall social status of the assigned category, which is just given by the function itself, IJ. In the basic case, individual persons J choose AJ to maximize utility, right? Taking as given the category assignment, CJ, EJ, and the norms. So you see that semicolon over there? That semicolon is really important. This semicolon is a distinction between the short run and the long run. Right? In the short run, everything after the semicolon is taken as given. What the categories are, the norms, your own category assignment, your own attributes, and then you just choose actions. But in general, or you might say in the long run, a person could also act to change their own category, their own attributes, and the societal norms. Hence all of those marches and activism, which we discussed. These norms here are ultimately something that someone can take an action over. Okay, so semicolon, short run versus long run. It could also be that, and I'm going to introduce a third party could come in and want to change these things after the semicolon as well, right? It's to possibly change the norm, change the ideals, change the category assignments. All right. So what I'm now going to do is use that basic utility function, which includes this identity function, and I'm going to build an example of an identity model with education and schooling. Okay, so this is with the model that I worked through, that George Akerlof and I had on schooling. So how do we start? We're going to start with a basic model of education, and then we're going to put in these identity ingredients. So that's the method. You start with a standard model, and then you add the identity agreements, just like I did in the previous two slides. So I've got a large population of individuals. Each individual has some sort of ability. Let's call this NI. A person's marketable skills or payoffs from effort choice in school, EI is their own effort choice and their ability. So VI is the marketable skills that they get, is a function of their effort, EI. And this is the cost of the effort. Okay, cost of effort. So obviously a person is going to be maximizing the optimal effort in schooling. If this is all we had, the person would be choosing EI to balance the benefits and costs of effort. Simple enough. So the question is this a good model of kids or adolescents? Are there a lot of kids out there that you see are balancing their costs and benefits, their marketable skills, payoffs from effort choice versus ability? It's not really clear that this is a really good model of children or adolescents. They may not be as cognizant of what this function looks like. But maybe even if we give them that they can see what marketable skills. And not to say that there aren't kids out there who understand that marketable skills come from working hard in school, but kids are also worried about other things. An identity model makes the child or adolescent the decision maker, and that child or adolescent as the decision maker is definitely or almost surely thinking about other things than just the marketable skills. As we know, kids and adolescents are often thinking about fitting in with their peers, having a peer group where they can hang out and have friends, just like this other model I was telling you about. Except now I'm going to be really specific about the norms. I'm just going to model the norms directly, right? So we're going to try and consider directly kids' motivations and interactions. And the model I'm going to build is a model of a United States high school, which is a particular educational setting, does not match lots of other educational settings out there in the world, other high schools. But it's the one that George and I wrote about. We wrote about it because we were able to find a huge amount of ethnographies about US high schools. And so we have a really good sense about how a US high school works. And you may recognize this from some bad TV shows. But some of those bad TV shows actually, do reflect a bit of what goes on in US high schools. Okay. All right. So how are we going to do this? We've got a large population of individuals. This is just the same thing we had before. A large population of individuals. Each individual has some exogenously given attribute NI, which is their ability. We have marketable skills, which are payoffs from ability and effort choice EI. So this is just what I had before. Okay. This is the standard model. Now we're going to introduce those identity ingredients. We're now going to give each individual a second exogenously given characteristic. We're going to call that L for looks. Okay, so this is something which is a socially desirable, as you'll see in a second, characteristic. Let's call it looks, somebody good looking or not. And that's some number between 0 and 1. Now we're going to introduce our social categories. So our social categories there are 3 social categories. We're going to have something called the leading crowd, something called the nerds, and something called the burnouts. Okay, so in different high schools, these will have different names. So the leading crowd are kind of like the cool kids, right? The nerds, and perhaps we all recognize what that is. The burnouts are the kids that are sort of hanging around in the school. They're late for class. They not paying much attention in school. They're a bit rebellious. So that's the burnout. So there's 3 social categories: the leading crowd, the nerds, and the burnouts. Okay, and kids want to sort of be in one of these, right? They want a peer group. Okay, so these are the categories, people will talk about. Is that a cool kid? Is that not, oh, that kid's a nerd? So this is the way kids will talk about their social world. Okay, so different words in different regions of the country. So if okay, there's different, but generally they're and more diverse. There's more diversity within these categories, but this is sort of the overall ethnography of a United States high school. And there's a very, very special US context, which I, of course, apologize for, because I know that this might not be the context which you all are most familiar with, but that is also, I think, a really important message of identity economics, is that you better know your context, right? So you have to know what context you're working with. This model will not necessarily work. You should not use this model everywhere in the world, right? This is a particular model of a particular place and at a particular time. And so if you're working in this identity space, you should be very aware of what village you're looking at, what capital of which country, et cetera. All right. Okay, so here we are in a, there's variation, but, sort of this, sort of a high school setting in a place in the United States.
Can I ask just a quick question?
Yeah, of course.
Obviously, it's clarified by the fact that one has a subscript I and the other one doesn't. But I'm just wondering why you chose to have 2 L variables, like when you're making
this L.
Yeah, you got L for leading crowd and then L for looks. Like I know one of them has I and not, but like.
Yeah, so LI is so individual I has a look.
Yeah, I guess I was just wondering like why when you were choosing your variables you chose.
Okay, so I'll explain it in just 1 second, and if there's still a question, I'll let you know. So this is that we've got some individuals have a number L equal to a half. Some individuals have a number L equal to a fourth. Some individuals have L equal to 3/4. So Li is a randomly selected number between 0 and 1. So I have a randomly selected number between 0 and 1. So L with the little RK at the bottom is some randomly selected number between 0 and 1. That's what that means. This is, let me explain what this is. For the leading crowd, I want to know what the ideal leading crowd member looks like. And the ideal leading crowd member should have an L of 1. Does that make sense? So the idea is that a leading crowd person has to be super good looking. The ideal leading crowd member has an L equal to 1. And so you're going to see in a second, I'm going to put up a utility function where if I have an L equal to a 4th, but the leading crowd ideal is a 1, then I'm 3/4 of the way distant from the ideal. Okay.
That makes sense. Thanks.
And so similarly for the nerds, I'm selecting the ideal for a nerd is an N of 1. So remember, these N's are also randomly distributed between 0 and 1. So I can have an N of an 1/8. But the ideal for a nerd is to have an N of 1. And so if I want to be a nerd, then, and I'm at 1/8, and the ideal for a nerd is at 1, then I'm 7/8 away from being the ideal.
Right. So someone might have maybe, like, you know, in terms of L, maybe I'm a half, but in terms of nerd, maybe I'm like 3/4. So maybe I have some characteristics of leading crowd, but I also have nerds. You can have both. Okay.
Exactly. So everybody has a little li and a little ni. So I might be 1/8 and 1/4.
Okay. Or
1/2 and 3/4. So everybody's got an li and everybody's got an ni.
And then what does like a burnout look like?
We're getting to that in a second.
Yeah, sorry.
So I don't have we decided not, in the modeling choices, we don't need to have an ideal for the burnouts in order for our model to work. But we could make them zeros, which is ultimately what it's going to look like. So there's something going on in the chat. Oh, almost 0 in an IID. Yes, but that's not what the L equals 1 means. So the L is a prescription. So do you remember in the model I had, I don't know if it's worth going back, but maybe it is really quickly. Let's see if I can go back fast. Oh, here we are. Yeah. So in the model, epsilon J is the individual's level of looks. That's their own characteristic. They're good looking and they're more or less smart. So they're more or less good looking or more or less smart. So that's an individual's own attributes. And the L equals 1 is what the norms say. That's the N. What the norms say a nerd should be. A nerd should have an N of 1. It's setting out the ideal. The ideal nerd has an N of 1. Now, it's true that no one person is going to have an N of 1, but they'll be further or closer from 1. Okay, is everybody all right? All right. So you'll see the utility function coming next. Where am I here? Okay. The other thing that I'm going to specify, so these are specifications of the model, is the ideal effort levels for the nerd, an ideal effort level for a leading crowd person, and the ideal effort level for a burnout. So remember, people are going to be choosing effort. Okay, so you're going to choose an effort level, and if you were a nerd, this is the effort level you're supposed to pick. You may or may not pick it, but this is the one you're supposed to pick. If you're in the leading crowd, this is the effort level you're supposed to pick. And if you're a burnout, this is the effort level you're supposed to pick. So if you're a burnout, you're not supposed to work very hard in school. So this is the prescribed, right? This is the should do effort level. Okay? All right. So the identity utilities, I'll have an equation on the next slide, depend on the category, the effort, and the fit with these ideals. Okay. So here, this is the identity utility. So remember here, this is the marketable skills this is the marketable skills payoffs from a choice of effort.
Professor, can I ask a question?
Yeah.
So here by effort level, do we mean effort to have a good grade? Because like it can take effort to be like sustained good looking.
No, this is efforts for grades.
Okay.
This is effort here is marketable skills. So it's an interesting question. Will people can they change their own looks, right? Right. Which obviously people could spend more or less, or is there a trade-off between trying to have certain look versus do well in school, right? But we're going to take Li here as a person's looks as exogenous, right? This is the looks a person has and they can't change it. Okay. And N, a person's N, right? their talent at school is also something that they just have. Okay. And so so let's look at this identity utility, right? So a person of a particular category, right? What is the identity utility? They get the status, I think that's the next bullet point, yeah. They get the status level from being in that particular category. So let's just do this for the leading crowd, right? If this is an L, then a person gets high status from being in the leading crowd. However, you have to subtract off of that, right? That if their particular L, so epsilon I here is for the particular person's, I can't get this thing to work, an individual's idiosyncratic attribute. To the extent that that's different in one, then there's a loss in utility. So if my Li is a fourth, and I try and be in the leading crowd, I get this high status, but I don't fit in very well. This is now a fourth, because this is a 3/4. So this is 1/4. So the distance here is 3/4. So that's a pretty high loss. I'm trying to fit in, but I don't really fit the ideal, right? And then on top of that, here's my effort choice. This is EL, right? We can substitute in here EL, which is the effort level for a leading crowd. And then when I choose my effort, I also have a utility loss, because I think that I'm one of these cool kids, but maybe I'm working hard in school, right? So I get a loss in identity from taking an action that doesn't fit the ideal for my category in terms of effort level in school. So there's two places where you have a loss in utility. One, when you don't fit the ideal of your category in terms of this attribute, say how this looks. And the other is in the loss in the extent to which I abide by the norm for my category. Okay, does everybody see how that works? It's very, very simple way of operationalizing that identity function, which I had 2 slides ago or 3 slides ago. Is everybody clear on this? I can't see you, so I would just presume if nobody asks me a question, I'll keep going.
Can I ask one question about this social categories? Is this mutually exclusive? Can somebody be both a burnout and also leading crowd? So L equal to 1 and equal to 1?
That's a great question. So in this model, you can only be one of them. It can't be both. Now, there is a literature out there on multiple identities. Typically, not in the high school literature, but for example, you can be, so some people talk about this in the literature on voting. So for example, you can be you vote like a father, right? But you work like you're not a father. So you can have one role in one context and one identity in another context, right? So there is notions of people having multiple identities. So, and we all do, right? So I'm a female American economist, right? So I've already got 3 of them right there. But I'm not male. I am an American and I am an economist. Okay, so that means I'm not one of these other categories, but I am those 3, right? So in this particular world, and again, they don't all have to be binary and they don't have to be, so mutually exclusive. So there can be, blends of lots of different things. And that depends on sort of what you're trying to accomplish in your model. Now, in this model, these are 3 distinct groups and you can only be in one of them. Okay.
Right. Then my question would be like, for example, for each individual, then how that person would sort of like know where is the boundary, where it is. Like how good looking
we're getting to that.
You need. Okay.
Perfect. We're getting to that. So that's in the next slide, I believe. Okay. So now grandiose, we have an individual's overall utility. So individuals, remember I had that semicolon. Okay. So here's a semicolon. So the semicolon here moved a little bit in my previous slide. It was over here, right here. Now I've moved it over here. Okay. So in a basic model, as I said, the category is given to you. You sort of wake up one day and you're told who you are. In this model, I'm going to allow people to pick their category. Remember, these are kids in high school and they're trying to fit in. So they're trying to say, should I try and be part of the leading crowd? Should I try and be a nerd? Should I try and be a burnout? You know, who should I be? Right? So there's this choice. And people talk about like this identity exploration, especially of adolescents. So I've now moved the semicolon over here. What is fixed is an individual's own attributes, which is the Li and the Ni. And what's also fixed is the ideal L, you know, L equals 1, the ideal N equals 1 for the nerds, as well as these effort levels, the ECs. And this is the person's utility. The person is going to pick both their effort and their category to maximize this utility function. This utility function, again, has two parts to it. It has the basic utility, right? The economic utility, marketable skills, and then it has this identity part right here, the second part. So a person is simultaneously choosing their effort in school and their category, and they're going to choose that effort in school and their category to maximize this utility. Okay, does that answer your question?
Yes, yes.
Okay, so this is pretty easy to solve, right? Because you have each person, you can see that there will be some people who will, given, you know, you might have a problem here, right? As was pointed out, you could have a very high N and a very high L, for example. So what's this kid going to do? This kid is really smart, is really talented in school, but is also really good looking. So are they going to decide to be a nerd and work hard in school, right? But then they have a loss in status because the status here for the nerds was lower than for somebody who was in the leading crowd. That was an assumption that I had down at the bottom, right? The status level. The leading crowd is a higher status than the nerds, than the burnouts. Or is the kid going to choose to be a leading crowd person? And if they choose a leading crowd person, want to be a leading crowd person, because they are really good looking, so they're going to not suffer that loss here, right? Because they're very close to 1, but they're also going to depress their effort in school, right? Because they want to be their effort, there's a loss in utility for working too hard in school relative to what a person in that group and their peer group should be doing. Okay, does everybody get the trade-offs? Everybody okay? I'm seeing a couple of nods. I can only see 4 of you. All right. Okay. So individuals are choosing effort and category to maximize utility. And just like I was saying, there's going to be trade-offs. There's going to be trade-offs between, of course, these kids, we suppose they have some notion that working hard in school gets you marketable skills. Fitting status, fitting in, right? And abiding by the norms for the categories. Oh, there, I've got all my nice little things working out. Status, I don't have to use the cursor. I had it all animated, fitting in and abiding by the norms. So for example, suppose there's somebody who had a very high NI and a low LI. Okay, that kid's choice is easy. The kid is going to choose to be a nerd and is going to work hard and have this high effort level close to, right, what the ideal effort level in school is for a nerd. So this person has high skills, they're going to fit in, and they're going to abide by the norms for their category, but they're going to suffer this lower status, but lower social status. Okay. So overall, individuals simultaneously choose effort and category. They're going to balance the payoffs from effort in school and fitting into the category and the status. So you can have a high L person who also has a high N, choose to be an L rather than an N. And so this is how the social pressures within the school would depress effort. Okay, it's very simple, right? So, something that is perhaps more universal than just an American high school, right? So as people have adjusted their behavior, the marketable part of their behavior, in order to fit into a social group, right? Okay, so it's a trade-off sort of between these identity payoffs and these economic payoffs. Now let's think about a low L and a low N student. Now this low and a person with a low, apologies, this should probably have these subscript I's on it. Now that I see the slides, these should have little subscript I's. Okay, so this is an individual that has a low Li. Their own individual attribute is a low L, and their own individual N is a low N. This student might choose to be a B rather than try and be an L or an N. So they want to be everybody wants to be a cool kid, right? Everybody wants to fit in with the cool kids, but they're not going to cut it in terms of their looks. And so rather than try and hang out with the cool kids, they reject the cool kid group and go decide to be a burnout. And so there's this word, I don't know if this word that people use, like, you don't want to be a wannabe. A wannabe is somebody who's trying to fit in, but they want to be, but they're not actually are, right? So these are people who sort of hang out in the periphery of this social group, but they don't really fit in. Some of those people may decide not to try and just go to the burnout group. Now, that might be fine, right? In terms of the social machinations of, in a particular high school. But when that burnout group also has associated with it norms for effort in school, that will lead to a depressed effort in school. It distorts the effort in school down. Okay, so here the person, in order to fit in with the burnout group, right, has to depress their effort in school. Everybody got it? Again, I can only see 4 of you, so, all right. So I think I pretty much have these next 2 bullet points. So a person is choosing effort in school according to the norms for their category. So the identity payoffs here are certainly going to distort academic achievement or schooling. So lower academic achievement or schooling for those who choose to be an L or those who choose to be an N. It can also work the other way. I don't have a bullet point for this, but there can be people who work way too hard in school relative to their own talent because they decide to be a nerd. Of all of these 3 choices, nerd is the best one, but that effort in school norm is very high, right? And so they may actually distort their effort too high. So we also have people working too hard in school too. So the fitting in part to your category, the fitting in is both in terms of this attribute that you have, but then you want to abide by the norms for your category in terms of working hard in school, right? So there's this norm in some American high schools that you're supposed to get good grades, but not work too hard, okay? So tell me how that happens. Well, people, don't necessarily reveal how hard they're working, which leads to this weird notion that, somehow that person over there is able to get these great grades, but they're not working, but they're just not showing you that they're working. So again, I'm just sort of elaborating on how these social pressures can work out. Okay. Now, suppose that is the model is representing, you can see this is a model that's really reducing the complexities of the social environment in a school by a huge amount. And I have not yet brought in race or ethnicity or even gender into this, but you see one could, right? You start talking about girls and boys and should girls be doing some sorts of, subjects and not other subjects, and boys taking some sort, et cetera, and all of the gender norms. So one could easily do that. But let's suppose that you were now running a school. Let me make sure this is the slide. Yeah, okay, make sure. Suppose that you were running a school and you recognize that this is what kids are doing, right? That kids are kids and kids are trying to fit in, and there's all of these different social arrangements and these social categories with these different norms, and these norms for the norms for what an ideal nerd looks like, what an ideal leading crowd looks like, as well as the norms for effort in school, are actually affecting achievement, right? It's affecting how much schooling kids get. So if you recognize that, then you might be able to actually have a better policy for if your objective is to get kids to have higher marketable skills. So suppose that's my objective as a school administrator, is I actually want the kids to study, right? And I want them to get higher marketable skills. So now I'm going to introduce a school policy. I'm going to introduce athletics. Now, again, this is, as I said, an American context. And you probably know that in a lot of American high schools, there are sports teams. So the sports are not in clubs that are outside. There are those. There are some sports which are in clubs outside of school, but a lot of sports by American teenagers are in the schools. So each school will have, the school has many sports teams. Now, if you're an American, you think, gee, I never thought of that as a policy, but it's a policy, right? So the schools have decided that they're going to spend money on athletic programs. Okay. So what does athletics do to our social arrangements? We're now going to add another social category called the jocks. Okay, so the jocks are part of the cool kids, okay, because the overall society somehow values athletics, right, and athletic achievement. So the jocks are now part of the leading crowd. And I'm going to add another characteristic that each student has, which is AI, which is their athletic ability. So now students have three characteristics. They have looks, they have talent in schoolwork, and they also have athletic ability. Okay, three categories, three characteristics. Oh, I should have said, whoops, I missed something on the slide. The ideal athletic ability attribute for a jock, of course, is 1, right? So, if you're going to be a jock, you should have A equals 1. Now, some people may be close to that or far away from that, but that's what it is, it's 1. So now we have an expanded choice set for our kids. Our kids now can choose among 4 different categories, right? They can be a burnout, they can be a nerd, they can be a leading crowd, or they can be a jock. Now, jocks are sort of part of the leading crowd. So jocks get you automatic admission to the leading crowd, right? And so we're going to have the same, it's another entree into the leading crowd, not just through your looks, but through your athletic ability. Okay. And so the norms for schooling are going to be those for the leading crowd, which means you work in school, but not too hard. Okay. All right. So now students are doing the exact same thing that we had them before. They're choosing their category and their effort level because they want to fit in. So here we can have a student with a high A, but a low L. No, I'm sorry, again, apologies. These should have little subscripts I on them. There's a student with a little high AI, a low LI, and a low NI. That student who would have been a burnout, remember, because they didn't fit within the leading crowd and they didn't fit in the nerds. Now this kid gets to be a jock. It's a choice they didn't have before. And they could fit in really, really well as being a jock. And so now gets to be an L. Okay. So this is now giving, again, a way a kid can be involved in the school in a different way, through a different social arrangement. And then this kid is then going to have a higher effort level than the kid would have otherwise had, because they now can be part of this leading crowd through the entree of athletics. Okay, so they get to have that identity, the identity of a jock. And you're going to abide by the effort norms of a jock. By the way, some schools have also explicit requirements. If you want to play on a team, you have to get good grades. So that's another more direct way of doing it, not just through the norms, but through actual more specific policies. So one might say, well, that's great. Now we have a bunch of kids who were burnouts, weren't working hard in school. Now they're on a sports team. And so they're going to work harder in school and perhaps get a diploma and go off into college where they might not have otherwise. Okay, but now let's look at these people. Now I have a kid who has a high A, AI, should have a subscript, a high NI. Oh, well, this kid before was going to be a nerd. And they were working really hard in school before. But now this kid's actually really good at sports. So this kid joins the track team or the lacrosse team or whatever it might be. And this kid then chooses to be in the leading crowd, chooses to be a jock leading crowd, rather than be a nerd. So we actually get a depressed effect of schooling for this kid. So this kid who was going to be a nerd now has this ability to be on the sports team, right? And so in the end has lower academic achievement than otherwise. So overall, we don't know what this policy has done. this policy of introducing athletics, which is interfering, or one could say maybe working with, or at least is, affecting the student through the student social arrangements, right? By introducing this other category. And I should say it's mirroring the adult world, right? So the fact that, the fact that athletes themselves are revered in a social context is, of course, coming from the larger social context in which this is all embedded, could overall increase or decrease the academic achievement of these kids. So this is an example. Oh goodness, we're way out. Are we way out of time? Or I have like 10 more minutes, no? Who's helping me with my time? Am I over time?
I think you are over time and eating into the break, but that's okay.
Okay, so let me finish this model and then we'll take the break. Well, thank you for your questions. That's what's drawn us. I really appreciate them. Okay, so, okay, I already said that. Now let's do just one last bit where we have a population with different ethnic and social groups. So nothing had ethnicity or social groups in them yet. Here, now we're going to have the curriculum is thought to favor one of the groups, perhaps the dominant or the majority group. So now the effort in school has another meaning to it. If you work hard in school, that means you're sort of abiding by the norms for the dominant social group, right? And we know we have these battles in US education all the time over literature, for example. So marketable skills may depend effort and mastering a particular curriculum. So this is not only, I say, language, right? So language is a battlefield, right? So people may need to know a particular language, be very skilled at a particular language to be able to have those marketable skills, which get them a job. But that language itself, right, in the social context, may not be someone's native language. It might be the language of the majority, in which case kids may or may not want to master that language because it has an implication for how they feel about themselves. So in the United States, we see this in the literature, the battles over literature. And we can actually see it picked up in people's attitudes towards math class versus English class, for example. There's more nuanced attitudes towards English class. So if a school recognizes this, the school policy could affect achievement by changing the curriculum to affect the identity payoffs of this effort in school. Okay, part 2. Economics and identity and inequality, economic experiment, part 2. This is part 2 of the lectures. Okay, now we're really switching gears here. We're moving to experiments rather than sort of theoretical treatments. And here I want to pose the following question, which I sort of said in the very, very beginning of the slides. Do some people have actual preferences for inequality? I mean, this is a week-long summer workshop on inequality. Inequality is a major subject of our profession and many professions. And so, do some people like it? And even though we think there's problems, and the answer is yes. And that's what I'm going to talk to you about now. So, but before I get to that result, right, I want to give you some background on the experiments that are out there that use as a manipulative, as an experimental variation, the social groups and the identity of the people or the identity of the individuals. So I'm just going to take a step back and eventually we'll get to that particular experimental conclusion. So I think we know the answers. Whoops. All right, hold on. Moved again. I got to have you guys on the side, otherwise I can't see my slides. Quite basic question, do people behave differently towards others depending on the identity of social groups? So we think that's true. When we read about it all the time, we read the ethnographies, we've got this empirical, we read the experiences of people with discrimination or non-discrimination, with adoration, et cetera. And we think the answer is yes. Okay, but can we identify those differences in behavior in a sort of in a rigorous way? And what I mean by that, identify it either experimentally, the data that's generated from experiments, or perhaps the data that's generated from the real world out there. And so I'm going to give you a hint, if I have time, at the very end, of some quote unquote real world experimental variation. Okay, so what I want to talk to you about and give you a sense of is first an overview, but then some specifics in one of my own experiments, where the variation, the extent of the variation is the social identity or the social category. So there's going to be treatments where people will be making decisions, and those treatments will be making decisions whether or not somebody is in their group or not in their group. So the question we're going to be looking at experiments where people's own actions are possibly different when their identity is salient. And there's also experiments out there where people play strategically differently when their opponent or their counterpart is in a different or similar social group. And one of the things I'm going to be looking at more intensely as we get into this is the questions about social preferences. So social preferences, you may or may not know, but I'll define them for you, are the preferences that an individual has over somebody else's income. So of course, I love having more money myself, but how do I value, how is my utility affected by the money that you have or the consumption that you have? Okay, so this isn't altruism, which is something else, but related. This is social, it's the world is called social preferences, and I'll give you a precise formulation of that as we go along. And so some of the social preference literature out there, some of the first discoveries were, for example, is that people have preferences for fairness. So I want my income and your income to be about the same, or the money I earn be about the same as money you earn. So that's some sort of notion of inequity aversion or inequality aversion. But as we know, the world isn't fair out there, and I'm going to talk about that a little bit more. Do people actually have preferences for inequality? Do people like situations where they make more than other people? Usually that's the way it works. You know, I like making more money than you, or have more money than you. Do some people have preferences for inequality? And the answer is yes. And it's going to depend on the social group, as you'll see. So overall, if we're in this experimental world and we want to try and identify the effects of behavior of different social groupings, the challenge in an experiment is to design an experiment with a social group variation, right? You have to have a social group variation, which you can implement in a laboratory, or now what we're doing is a lot of online experiments, of course. So what are the two main ways in which people do this? One way is to literally use real world groupings. So people may have different ethnicities or different members of social clubs, and that's revealed in the experiment. So for example, somebody's last name might reveal their ethnicity. Or people might say, this person is in the same club you're in, or the same platoon you're in, or the same group you're in school. So, or actually a fan of the same football club, right? So there are real world groups out there which are used in the lab to kind of identify people as being in different social groups. Now, of course, when you do this, you have to still preserve anonymity. It can't be too small a group. It can't be your roommate, right? It should be somebody that is, because you want to avoid sort of the repeated game effects. I'm going to encounter this person outside the lab and really get upset with them for what they did to me inside the lab. So you really have to, in an experimental design, be careful about that. So you want to create groups, but not create repeated effects. Or sorry, utilize groups, but not but avoid repeated game effects. Another method, which is you create laboratory groups. So you create groups in the lab, and that's where, and you'll see in some of the experiments that I'm going to show you, is that people enter the lab and they get assigned to groups. So you're in group A, you're in group B, for example. Okay, and so those are sometimes called minimal group experiments, and so I'll describe those later. So there's really two ways of doing this: is these real world groups, which are then used, those labels are used inside the lab, or there's real sort of fictive groups which are created inside the lab. Okay, so going back to here, this is the order that we're going to go into. I'm going to first just give you a sense of some experiments that affect people's own actions. Then I'm going to give you a sense of, these are very brief. Then I'm going to give you a sense of how experiments where people are in different groups affect strategic play. And then most of the time, I'm going to be talking about these social preferences experiments. Okay, so that's what I'm going to be doing. So first, own actions. Okay, so the first is really quite remarkable experiments. Maybe, I'm sure some of you may be familiar with this. There's this notion of stereotype threat. That's the original paper. The idea is that people are put into a context, an experimental context, and then there is a script which is read, which then triggers, right, a person's, or cues is another word that's often used, cues a person's ethnic identity. And then that, if that is, identity becomes cued, then people will act more in ways that are consistent with that identity than if that script had not been read and that identity had not been cued. Okay, so I'm going to give you an example of this in a developing country context. This is a really interesting experiment that looks at, of course, I'm using an inequality example, right? So of discrimination, social identity, and durable inequality. And this is an experiment that's done in India. So children are okay, this is India. Children are paid to solve mazes. So you have a maze, you solve the maze, and you get, the kids get a piece rate pay for every maze that they solve. So it's incentivized experiment. 3 conditions. In one condition, the kids are just given the mazes and they solve the mazes and they get paid. In another condition, as we know in India, there's caste, and caste is revealed by the name of the kid. So there's a room where kids are mixed caste. So the kids aren't mixed caste. There's a room where there's kids of different castes in the same room. Okay. And the caste is revealed. So people's names are called so that people know that I can be sitting there. I know that I'm a lower caste and my kid next to me is a higher caste. Okay. And then there's separate rooms where kids in one caste are in one room and kids in one caste are another room, but their names are still read so that the idea is people are aware that somebody knows their caste. Okay. And the remarkable result is that the lower caste subjects completed fewer mazes in both caste conditions relative to the control. So this is just simply making caste salient is what the interpretation is just sort of making caste something that somebody is somehow in the kids' minds. And I'm using that term loosely. I don't know what's in their minds or not in their minds, but it's just that the caste is made is salient or is sort of revealed. The lower caste subjects completed fewer mazes despite the pay. Okay, so just a very simple experiment, very powerful set of literature that's on this sort of this stereotype of threat. So just making a person's social identity, again, I'm using the word salient loosely because we honestly don't know what emotionally is happening to any experimental subject, changes their behavior in the lab.
Professor, can I ask a question?
Sure.
So usually low caste people are usually from low income background. So they might have poor nutrition and low IQ. So do they control for those factors?
Yeah, relative to the control, relative to the anonymous control. Yeah.
I see. Okay.
Yeah, exactly. So you have to have a control, right? You have to have you should have a control. You don't have to. Some people, a good experiment will have a control, right? And so these two could be compared to each other. One where you have segregated versus integrated, but they also have an anonymous version. Okay. Now let's look at strategic games. So if we put people in, if we somehow reveal people's ethnicity, do we see different pay in strategic games? There's an experiment in Israel, discrimination in a segmented society. And the objective is, do people discriminate about, I'm not going to have a chance to get into discrimination versus stereotypes, but the basic question is, are people playing differently vis-a-vis other people? And so there were 3 different games. There was a trust game, a dictator game, and an ultimatum game. And the bottom line is that indeed, there was differential behavior based on the ethnicity of the counterpart. So here the trust game, I think, is obviously particularly interesting, is that even though these students of Eastern origin returned about the same amount of money, they were actually sent less money. Okay, so that's sort of evidence of perhaps some discrimination because there was nothing about their behavior, right, which would have led the folks to have sent less money. And the trust result was only true for men. So there's both a gender and an ethnicity effect within this behavior. So this is looking at a strategic setting where you've manipulated the ethnicity of the players, and you see some discriminatory and stereotypical, possibly stereotypical behavior. Okay, so now I'm going to get to the main part of what I wanted to talk to you about, which is the literature on social preferences and social preferences related to groups. Specifically, it's going to be groups, and there's no ethnicities here. It's just going to be different social groups. So as I said before, social preferences is the value that one person places on the other person's income. So we're going to use income here rather than consumption. So there's many experiments that try and understand people's social preferences, and a lot of them use a task that looks something like this, where an individual I is the decision maker, and I is choosing between income allocations, either the top row or the bottom row. So there's these matrices, and so if individual I chooses the top row, I gets pi I, and another person gets pi j. Or if I chooses the bottom row, then, okay, there's two different other numbers here with a prime, right? So there's a long literature with this kind of task, okay? And the main result, I've got a bunch of them here, of looking at that have this task or something similar to that, is that if you bring in a group of people into an economic lab and you have them, do a lot of these choices, matrices that look like this with lots of different numbers in them, different values, but you have them do these choices, and then you take a look at their choices. You can see that one of the main results of this earlier literature is that people seem to be inequity averse. That's the word that's used. People are making choices where that the difference between these income levels is smaller. Right? So this is money for I, this is money for the other person. They're choosing the rows where the difference in those incomes is smaller. Other versions, of these experiments would say that people are picking the rows where the sum of these two is larger. So that would be a social welfare maximizers. And so the result of this kind of literature when it first came out was, look, people aren't only self-interested. They're not only choosing the row here that has the highest money for I is the decision maker, they're choosing a row that has, they're willing to give up some of their own income in order to make the income levels closer together, or that the sum overall is higher. Okay. Now, you might say, oh, that's kind of interesting, right? People are not only self-interesting, they're also inequity averse, and they're also trying to maximize the whole pie. That's wonderful. People are really great, aren't they? But let's do a reality check on those social preference experiments. So group conflict is a feature of human history. We've just been talking about that. Well, we actually haven't been talking about this. We've been talking about we started introducing caste and these ethnic groups within Israel, and in the previous previous part of the talk, we were talking about, different ethnicities and so forth. Now, if we start moving towards groups, we can know that groups, and often these groups are related to ethnicities and national boundaries and so forth, are a feature of human history. So groups are often defined on religion, race, nationality, or culture. Yeah, we were talking about, the soccer, the football teams, etc. And, a lot of this conflict was people were not acting in any way that was inequity averse, right? Rather, these group conflicts are often associated with forcibly extracted labor, right? So this is not like, oh, these conflicts are conflicts, and people are trying to extract labor and extract resources from other people. Just adding more fuel to this, there's county and regional borders, civil wars. Those civil wars are often about alternative identities. So one of the, as we know, the most destructive war in American history was the American Civil War, right? And all civil wars are, they're huge death tolls, right? In civil wars, more than there are in foreign wars. Civil war is not, one would say the Civil War is over, but these things are still contested. That is a picture from just 2 years ago in South Carolina. just to say that, these conflicts are still going on. If I have a chance, we're going to come back to these folks. We'll see if I get to that part of the lecture. Okay. So this is a kind of reality check. So these social preference experiments that brought everybody into the lab, they said, oh, people are inequity averse. Yeah, but what about all of this? Are people inequity averse out there? Or is there, actually people might not be inequity averse at all. Some people are actually, I want to get everything you have and I want to take it for me, right? Because we also see that that's happened. Perhaps based on group boundaries, right? Okay. So now, of course, this is nothing new in the world of social sciences, right? That group conflict is something really important to study and really important to study in an experimental context, right? So, and I'm not the first economist to do it. I'm going to get to another person who's done it too, before me. So, but going back into the social psychology literature, so World War II and the group conflict and the destruction of that war led to a lot of work within social psychology on group conflict and the destructiveness of group conflict. So some of the famous experiments, in case you don't know what they are, that wasn't all meant to come up at the same time, but well, let's go to these 2 bullet points first. There's this wonderful experiment, a Robbers Cave experiment, where these social psychologists brought kids, 12-year-old kids, to a camp in Oklahoma, and they separated them into groups, and then they brought them together actually to do sports like swimming races and running races and so on. And they called each other names, and they started making chants about each other, and all of this sort of, you might say they created group conflict from these 12-year-old kids, in this 2-week-old camp, and they were pretty nasty to each other. A later experiment is by this team. And what they did is they said, maybe we don't have to bring kids out to the summer camp and have them spend 2 weeks camping somewhere to create this animosity. Maybe we're going to see this animosity if we simply divide people into groups, Group A and Group B. And that's the first minimal group experiment. And indeed, you divide people, and again, it was also young adolescent boys were the experimental subjects here. They were presented with these kinds of matrices, a little bit different than the ones I just showed you, but they were all matrices, and they were divided into groups. And they were not picking about any money for themselves, right? They were just picking. So there's somebody in my group over there, and there's somebody in another group, and I'm going to pick an allocation where it gives somebody not in my group and somebody who's in my group, but their own payoffs weren't involved. And they found that these kids chose payoffs that were divergent, right? So less for somebody out of their group, more for somebody who was in their group, even though their own payoffs were not involved. So you saw that these kids were opting for divergent levels. So Chen and Lee is this wonderful paper in the economics literature that married, that was the first paper to marry the minimal group paradigm with the social preference experiments that I just told you about, right? Where people are choosing in these matrices. So it was a marriage of the social psychology of minimal groups with the economic experiments of social preferences. So therefore, social preferences and groups, and they were using the minimal group paradigm. So what they did is they brought people into a laboratory, divided them into groups. By the way in which people are divided into groups, the classic way of doing this is the participants are asked questions about paintings. They're asked about paintings that are by Klee and papers by Kandinsky. That's the original minimal group experiment. And so the people are asked, do you like this painting or that painting, this painting or this painting, this painting or this painting? And then people are divided into groups according to these painting preferences. Or they could just be randomized and say, thank you for your preferences. We're now dividing you into groups. So it's a little subtle there as to, how exactly the groups are being divided. So anyway, Chen and Lee used this minimal group paradigm to divide subjects into groups in the lab. And they had them allocate income to self and others. Let me see if I have a picture of it. And let me show you what it looked like. Going back to here, they were exactly doing these matrices. So a person was allocating income to self and other, where this person, the J person, was either somebody in I's group or not in I's group. Okay, everybody Got that? So you were presented different decisions, money for me, money for somebody else. That somebody else could either be in my group, or in another choice that somebody else was not in my group. Okay. So the subjects were asked to allocate income to self and others, and they were comparing the allocations, right? The choices of these rows of these matrices, when the person who was the J, the little J, subscript J, was a person in their group versus somebody who was out of their group. And the result is that individuals indeed did make a difference, did choose differently. They chose different rows in these matrices, depending on whether the J person was in their group or out of their group. And the result is that overall, subjects were inequality averse. So they didn't like inequality. They were just less inequality averse to the people that were there in there, the people that were in the other group. Okay, has everyone got the result? So there's own group, other group, and you're inequality averse. Oh, I could just flip it. You're inequality averse to somebody who's not in your group, and you're more inequality averse to somebody who's in your group. So you're more sensitive to inequality for somebody who's in your group, but you're still sensitive to inequality, and you don't like it if somebody's out of your group. And that's the main result. It's a remarkable result that they, again, there's this marriage of the social psychology methods with economic experiments. So it's a really path-breaking paper. And what they're doing is they are estimating, there's a structural model of a utility function, and they're estimating the social preferences. So the model is, so your utility depends on your own income and the other person's income. Here is the weight on your own income. Rho here is the weight on the income difference. So the difference in income between you and the other person when you are here is positive. So pi I is greater than pi j. And then there's another parameter, sigma, if j is actually making more money than you. So they were looking at advantageous inequality versus disadvantageous inequality. Okay. So the finding is that for both when J is in the group versus J is not in the group, I'm sorry, I should have said that when these utility function parameters are estimated, you can look at the sign of these utility function parameters, and that will tell us whether somebody is inequity averse. So if beta is positive, we assume people like their own income. But if a rho is negative and sigma is negative, it means that somebody does not like inequality, right? Right, so they're inequality averse. Okay, and so the result of this paper is that, yes, indeed, individuals are inequality averse, and they're just, the direction of the arrow means that they're just less inequality averse for somebody who's outside of their group. Okay, so we do see a distinction between people who are in their group versus out of their group. They're making different allocation decisions, but still overall, they're inequality averse. Okay, so that's the result. Oh, but wait, I just told you that, human conflict, group conflict is a feature of human history. So how can we reconcile this history with the previous result, which I just told you? Okay, so that's the jumping off point for a set of experiments, which I conducted with a set of co-authors. Is we wanted to understand this result, that we wanted to really dig into this result. Why were we not seeing in these experiments this behavior where people treated people in the other group badly, right? So in these experiments, on average, people were treating the other people in the other group pretty well. They were inequality averse. They were giving up own income to make the two levels of income closer together. So I embarked on this journey to try and understand what was going on in these social preference experiments, and to try and see what was going on about these choices between these, these income levels, and trying to see, it just didn't match. I just felt like we weren't really getting at even, sort of the original social psychology results, which were that we did see people picking these divergent incomes rather than income levels that were closer together. So a hypothesis was that maybe that this literature this previous literature didn't have a strong enough identification with the group, right? So we weren't the minimal group was not a particularly strong manipulation, and that within these minimal groups is that you didn't have people who were more strongly attached to the group than other people. So we were thinking, oh, it's these people who are really attached to their group, who really identify with their group. They're the ones who are going to, have this, choose these divergent incomes rather than try and make the incomes closer together for somebody who's outside their group. So that was sort of the working hypothesis. Turns out to be wrong, but I'm just going to tell you where we started. I think it's also sort of an interesting, instructive case to see we started somewhere and we got somewhere else. So that was what we thought. That's what the team was after. So do people who identify more with their group engage in more discriminatory behavior? So if I really feel, American, is that going to make me more apt to act in a discriminatory way to somebody who's not? Than somebody who's like, oh, sure, whatever. Yeah, I carry that passport. Okay. So the findings are no, actually, we don't find that. But we found something else, which we think is pretty interesting. And it's going to relate back to those people that I showed you before who were waving the Confederate flags, if I am able to get to that part in the talk. We do find that some people seem to adopt behavior that is groupy more than other people do. So there's a tendency, we think, for people to, if they're in a group, to act in a discriminatory way, but not everybody does that, right? So some people we think are, the word we're using is groupie, and some people are not groupie. So some people, you put them in a group and they're in the group, they're going to act according, they're going to, try and act in for the benefit of that group. And other people, you put them in the group yeah, whatever. Okay. And so, but then you say, okay, but I don't get it. You just told me that there was a systematic way in which people were adopting this difference, right, between in-group and out-group. Well, if you average these people together, right, you can get the previous results. In fact, we replicate the Chen and Lee results, but we deconstruct the average to find these individuals. So we look at the individual level rather than at the average, hence the deconstructing bias in the title. Okay, so some people have no in-group bias. They actually act the same towards everybody. They're not doing anything differently towards people who are in the group, who are out of the group. But some people do have a very strong in-group bias. And in fact, we found our destructive folks. So we were successful in finding the people who acted destructively towards people in the other group. And I'll show those folks to you. So now again, if you average them, this is consistent with an average of inequity aversion. So when we average everybody, people look but inequity averse, but we're actually taking the average of two very distinct kinds of behavior. And so this tendency for in-group bias could be something about an individual, perhaps but not, not that they're born with it, but it could be from circumstances that people start to adopt a tendency for an in-group bias. So I see stuff going on in the chat. Should I be looking there or, okay. Yeah, I'll take a look at that. So can social contact? Yeah, so I'm going to talk about social contact. I have some work on that too. So we'll talk about social contact if I can as well. All right. So once we believe that there's this idea that there's some people who are groupie and some people who are not groupie, are there somehow individual correlates of that, right? So can we have any notion of who is a groupie person and who's a not groupie person? And are there settings or information, actually contact is what we're going to get to, change the behavior towards others? All right. So remember what we're trying to accomplish here. We were trying to create a setting where people were more or less attached to their group. So we employ within subject design with two different conditions. There's a minimal group condition and there's a political group condition. So the minimal group condition the subjects are choosing between whether they like a clay painting or a Kandinsky painting. And in the political condition, we're going to be looking at, this is a symbol for Democrats, and this is a symbol for Republicans. And we're going to be looking at people who more or less strongly identify with being Democrats or being Republicans. And so the results are is that we replicate this in-group bias on average, but there's this huge heterogeneity among the population, our subject population, as to what they're doing. And again, we see groupie versus not groupie individuals. Okay, so Lanya, I'm going to rely on you to see if there's a question in the chat or just comments. Okay, so if there's a question, just shout it out.
Yeah, there was actually a question from Philippus, who is asking whether that would be the case that individuals pay less attention to out-of-group allocation as a cost minimization behavior. So for example, they save time.
We're actually going to see that, I have some time questions. They actually are groupie people, actually take more time. So yeah, it could be that there's some people just want to do things fast. That is possible, but we do see people who slow down. So I can't say that the people who move fast are never groupie, but I do know that the people who who are in their behavior and their choices are making a distinction between somebody in their group and out of the group are also taking more time, right? So they must be somehow attending to the difference. So when I get to, hopefully I'll get to the time differences, the time stamps later in the presentation. Okay, so this is done at Duke University, so a bunch of American college students in a no deception lab. The schematic of the experimental section is that we have the instructions, which take 3 to 5 minutes. Then when we have a control with no groups, right? So there's a non-group control, so people are making these choices with no group labels whatsoever. Then we have a minimal group or the political group treatment. These two treatments are randomized. And then we have a post-experiment survey. And so the minimal, some people got the minimal group first and some people got the political group first. And people were paid for one choice in each setting, control, minimal group, or political group. So the political group sort of requires a bit more elaboration because this is kind of a main experimental manipulation. For the political group treatment, participants self-identified as either Democrat, Republican, Independent, or none of the above, which of course are these American political categories: Democrat, Republican, Independent, or none of the above. If people answered Independent or none of the above, they were asked a further question if they were closer to the Democrats or closer to the Republicans. Then we divided the subject pool into two groups. The people who said they were Democrats went into the Democratic group, and the people who were Independent or none of the above, but said they were closer to the Democrats, also went into the Democrat group. Okay. People who were Republicans went into the Republican group. The people who were Independent or none of the above, but said they were closer to the Republicans, also went into the Republican group. So within each of these two groups, I have people who said they were Democrats and people who said they were not Democrats, but just leaned Democratic, right? So I have within this group people who were more or less arguably attached to the group to which they were assigned. And the same thing here on the Republicans. So the original objective was to compare the results of the Democrats versus the Democratic leaning independents, thinking that these are the people that are going to really, try and be nasty towards the Republicans, and the Republicans are going to be trying to be nasty towards the Democrats, but maybe not these guys because, they didn't say they were Democrats or Republicans. It turns out in that comparison, I can only compare these two because we didn't have enough Republicans in our sample. I have the data, but they're basically the tests have very, very little power. So in that comparison, we're only looking at Democrats and Democratic leaning independents, which is sort of a little detail as we move through the results. Okay, so this is sort of how the experiment looked. Again, people were choosing this is how these matrix experiments work. People were choosing between rows in the matrix. So they were displayed these screens. The U is giving their own payoffs. The other is indicating whether it's the person to whom they're giving the money is somebody in the other group or somebody in their group. So let me just, 26 matrices, top group, everything is randomized. Okay, just get a sense of what these choices mean. So if a person is choosing this top row here, for example, the person is, actually, let's have the person choose the bottom rows. The person is choosing this 120-20 row. This person, if they choose this row, is giving up 20 and making the other person go down 80. So this person is giving up money to make the other person worse off. So this is the type of behavior that we said, wow, why aren't we seeing this in all this social preference literature? Where is it? Why isn't it there? And why isn't it there related to groups? Oh, why didn't it do that? Whoops. Yeah, okay. Now there's, and then if this were the person with this in your own group, this would not say other on top, but it would say own instead of other. Okay, so what are the results? So the first thing we did is took a look at the data, the raw data, and said, let's look at individual favoritism in allocating income. So for individual I in condition G for a given matrix, let's calculate the difference in the money that was given to somebody in the person's own group versus income given to somebody in the other group. So this is the same matrix, right? It's exactly the same matrix. There's 26 of these matrices. What I basically want to know is when, for example, if a person was making the selection on this matrix when it said own, maybe they gave the top row, which gave 100 to the other person. And when the person was in the other group, they chose the bottom row, which only gave 20 to the person J. So that would be 100 minus 20, so 80 difference, right? So that's favoritism towards a person in your own group on that matrix, okay? Then we average over 26 matrices, right? So that gives a favoritism level for individual I. It's a measure of how much individual I, our subject I, is making different decisions when they're faced with exactly the same matrix, right? But the person that they're giving the money to is either in their own group or in the other group. So this is giving favoritism for individual I towards own group. Okay, and then we're going to compare individual I's favoritism in the minimal group experiment versus I's favoritism in the political group experiment. So one of the things we also thought is that the political group experiment, the political group setting, is also somehow more salient. I mean, aren't Democrats and Republicans, isn't that a much more salient thing than these Clay and Kandinsky paintings? Okay. So let's take a look at the favoritism towards the in-group, which is that measure I was just saying, in the political group treatment. So this is all of the subjects. And so indeed, we're seeing that people have this favoritism, right? So this is the median is the line, the mean is this diamond, and that's the confidence intervals. Okay, so we do see that in the political treatment that people show favoritism towards the in-group. And if we compare Democrats, the Democratic leaning independents, well, this looks interesting, right? The Democrats seem to show more in-group favoritism than the Democratic leaning independents. So say, oh, that's evidence that those people who are more attached to their group, the Democrats, actually show more favoritism towards their group. So we take a look at that, and indeed that difference in the mean level of favoritism is significant. Okay, so we thought that's good news for our hypothesis. However, we also have this minimal group condition. And here we see in some almost exactly the same pattern. The Democrats are showing more favoritism towards the in-group than the Democratic leaning independents, but in the minimal group treatment, and something that had nothing to do with politics. Okay, you got that? So the Democrats here, the people who said they were Democrats, are showing more in-group favoritism in the minimal group treatment than the Democratic leaning independents. And it turns, and then we look at the, we look at the difference here, and the difference is significant. I gotta move you guys. You guys ended up here somewhere. I gotta move you. I don't know how you moved there. Oh well, I can't see my slides. All right. I can't tell if I'm now showing you the difference in the difference. Yes? Okay.
Yes.
Okay, good. So if you can see that the difference in the difference is 0, right? So the difference between these two and these two, the difference in those differences is 0. So essentially what we're seeing is that the people who say they're Democrats are acting in a biased way in both settings, right? In both this minimal group setting and in the political group setting. It doesn't seem to matter which setting they're in. They're acting in a more biased way than the people who are Democratic leaning independent. So this is leading us to think, oh, maybe there's some people who just act in a biased way, no matter what group they're in. Okay, so what we've got here is, let me see if I don't know why you guys have moved. Wait, hold on. Okay, I cannot move this. All right, I can't move. Like for some reason, I can't move this. Oh, wait, I couldn't see part of my slides. Okay. All right, that's better. All right, so what I've got here is now all of the subjects, right? And I've put them, I'm seeing whether there are some people who favor their group in the minimal group treatment and favor their group in the political group treatment, or there's some who show favoritism in one of the treatments and not the other. And indeed, there's a very, very high correlation. Well, this is the 45-degree line, right? So these people in this sort of circle, these people are showing very little favoritism in either treatment, right? So they're not showing favoritism towards their group. And they're not showing favoritism towards their group in the minimal group treatment, and they're not showing favoritism towards their group in the political treatment. Oops. These people, on the other hand, are showing high levels of favoritism in the minimal group treatment and high levels of favor in the political group treatment. So these people are showing a lot of favoritism regardless of the group context. And then of course we tested for the correlation and for the regression line. So this is where we get to start to see the notion is that, this is interesting. Some people are just going to act in this biased way in a group context, whatever that group context is. Of course, we've only tested 2 here, right? Minimal group and political group. So I can't say in all groups, right? But at least in the context of this experiment, we have some people who are acting in this biased way in both. So now when we took a look and we did the exercise that Chen and Lee did, where we also are going to estimate social preferences. And we do exactly the same exercise as Chen and Lee did. We estimate this this utility function, the parameters of this utility function, and indeed we get exactly the same results. Almost, maybe not numerically, but the exact same pattern. On average, people are inequity averse. So if we just did exactly the same exercise, and they're in both treatments, the minimal group treatment and the political group treatment. But this is a within subject design. So we have a lot more information about each person. So our question is, given what we just saw before, people are acting really differently from each other here. These are distinctly different patterns. These dots are not, each of these dots is a person, and these people are doing something very different than these people over here. So maybe the average isn't the right thing to be looking at. We should try and understand what individuals are doing and see if there's patterns, certain people who are, certain types of people. So that was the next exercise. So we're trying to get a sense of individual estimates of social preferences. And for that, we use something called a mixing model. So we're estimating the utility function parameters for a given number of utility function types. So if T was 141, that would be each individual was their own type. If T equals 1, we would have been looking for the average, right? But we looked for 4 different types. And there's reasons for those 4 different types that are kind of too complicated to go into within this short time that I have. But it was enough to get us the canonical kinds of types that are in the literature. And to be clear, we didn't say, here are the types. We said there are 4 of them, and let's see what the utility function parameters look like for 4 different types. So we estimated t equals 4, which was just enough to be able to, if there were 4 different types, that we could, that could match the canonical types of preferences out there, we would be able to capture them. But again, 5, we did estimate 5. It doesn't give us more precision. It just kind of split one type into 2 subtypes. But to be clear, the data is giving us the parameter of the types and the percentage of the population who are in each type. So basically, we are asking the likelihood function to give us the parameter estimates for 4 types and the percentage of population of each type to maximize the likelihood function. Once we have those types, right? So that's utility function parameters for the types. We then go back to the individuals and ask, does each individual fit as one of the types? So does each individual have a type in each treatment and for each pairing? Okay, so that's what we did is we said, okay, so we have these notions, here's these utility function types. This is the parameter estimates that go with people that we can look at those parameters and say the people who have these kinds of parameters, they're selfish. The people who kind of have these parameters are inequality averse. The people who have these other kind of parameters are social welfare maximizers. And the people who have another set of parameters are, have this destructive behavior, right? Then we have those utility function parameters, and then we look whether each individual's behavior matches those utility function parameters. And we have a probability that each individual is a particular type. Okay. And that matching is actually remarkably precise. So with 95% confidence, we know that each individual's behavior is consistent with a particular type, utility function type. And then, okay, the last step is to identify groupie versus non-groupie individuals. So that's all a mouthful, but I'll show you a little picture, which I hope will help. So the non-groupie people are the people who had the same utility type, whether they were facing the person who was in their group versus person outside of the group. So a non-groupie person, say, was going to grab all the money for themselves, so be a selfish type. So that meant beta was very high, rho was low, and sigma was low. And they had that same utility function, or they were the same utility type, whether somebody was in their group or out of their group. Okay, that's what we're calling a not groupie person. Another kind of not groupie person was somebody whose beta was positive, rho was negative, and sigma was negative. This is an inequality averse person, and they're inequality averse whether somebody's in their group or out of their group. Okay, but a groupie person is somebody who switched. So a groupie person, for example, for somebody in their group would have had beta positive, rho negative, and sigma negative. So they were inequality averse for somebody in their group, right? But when it was somebody outside of their group, we had beta positive, rho 0, and sigma 0. They just grabbed all the money for themselves. Okay, so so we have a crosstab, right? We have the people who, these are just subjects, and we've put them into how they behaved, their utility function types, when they were giving money to somebody who was in their group, own, versus giving money to somebody outside of the group. And so the people along the diagonal didn't change their utility types. So these are people who were selfish, grabbed my money, their beta was positive and the other two were 0. Right, whether the person they were giving money to, allocating money to, was in their group or out of group. These are the people who were inequality averse, for people who were in their group or out of group. These were people who were, total income maximizers. These were inequality averse. And these were these dominant seekers. And those people, we're calling them not groupie. Essentially, they could have gone through this experiment and not paid attention to own and other on the top of the matrices. The off-diagonal people were groupie. They switched their utility type. They had distinctly different choices, different behavior. when they were giving money to somebody who was in their group versus when they were giving money to somebody who was out of their group. So the people I've circled here, right, they were inequality averse when they were giving money to somebody in their group, but they were dominance seeking, meaning trying to slam the other person, right? So giving up money for themselves to make the other person worse off when that person was outside of their group. So this is somebody, these people are paying attention to those labels. Everybody off the diagonal is switching their behavior, right? When they see own on top of the matrix versus other on top of the matrix. So when we go through this, we have a well-identified set of people who are adopting exactly the same behavior, whether it says own or other on top of these matrices. And we have people that are making different choices, right? And very distinctly different choices when it says own versus other on the top. So we're dividing our subject pool into people who are attentive to the group differences, and there are people who seem to be inattentive to the group differences. Now, of course, we don't know what's going on in their heads, right? We just know that there's this behavior, and then we can match this behavior to these utility types. We can see that they're adopting very distinctly different behavior. I'm using the word attentive, but I don't really know what's going on in their heads, and I don't have eye tracking, which would have been nice, but we didn't have it. But we do have, okay. We do have the time differences. So the timestamps of how long it took people to make these decisions. And that is sort of reinforces the idea that people are attending to own other labels versus not. So what I'm now looking is at the time it took for people to make the decision to make their allocation decision. And I'm looking at not groupie people versus groupie people. Okay, so the first thing you should notice is that when the utility, we use the utility functions to estimate the utility difference between the two rows. So, there are these two rows on these matrices. Those two rows, each row translates into a utility number. And if those utility numbers were very close to each other, it took longer to make the decision. Okay, so when the choices are very close, it took people longer. That's a well-known result, and we see that here. When the utility function was larger, people were able to make that choice faster. But the not groupie people, turn this dark line, made all decisions faster than the groupie people. Just saying that, and again, I don't know what's going on in their heads, but it looks like, we could possibly think that people have to take that extra moment of time to notice that on the top of the matrix, it says own and other, because they're switching their choices depending on what it says on top of the matrix, whereas the not groupie people aren't. They're just making the same choice regardless of what it says on top of the matrix. Okay, so now if we believe, I've convinced you that there are people out there who are attentive to groups, and there are people who are less attentive to groups or don't pay much attention to the groups. If we think that there's some people who are groupie out there and there's some people who are not groupie out there, is there any demographics that would indicate who these people are? Are there correlates with other kinds of behavior or other kinds of circumstances? So, So in this particular sample, the groupie people, there's 85 groupie people and 48 not groupie people. And basically, these are just the ones we tested. Women, race, born in the United States, but two do come out. If a person was politically independent, they were more likely to be not groupie than groupie. And actually, this made sense because this is how we found these folks to begin with. So what this is saying is that, what this is telling us is that there are people out there who share the same political opinions, because we know they had exactly the same political opinions. But those that said they were independent, they didn't join a group, right? They didn't join a party. They don't feel like they're a member of a party. That's what this is saying. That's what political independent means here, right? Is that they exactly, because we know their political opinion. So these people have exactly the same political independent opinions as people who are in a party, but they say they're political independents. And that's correlated with being not groupie. And then we have the folks whose fathers have an advanced degree. And this is kind of interesting. I don't know, don't want to make too much of it, but it says that this could either be obviously education effect. So higher overall family level of education, the less likely you are to be groupie, but the mothers don't seem to work for that. This could also be an income effect because a father advanced degree is a much higher family income. So this could be a family income effect. So we don't know what's going on here, but it does come out as one of the demographic variables that's correlated with this not groupie behavior. Okay, so that was in this Duke sample. If we took a look overall, so we had a follow, that was the main study. And then we followed up with an MTurk study that was nationwide in the United States. And there, we did see some interesting regional differences. So the respondents who said they were Republicans and lived in the Deep South. So I should say that we didn't ask where they lived. We did it from their IP addresses. We could see where people were answering the survey from, right? But we did ask people if they were Republicans or Democrats. And then we identified from their IP addresses where they were living. So if the respondent, when we look across the regional differences and the political differences, so you can cross those, Republicans Deep South, Democrats Deep South, et cetera. Republicans in the Deep South had a greater tendency to be groupie than any of the other combinations. So relative Republicans in the Northeast, for example. So that's where we can get my South Carolinians who are waving their Confederate flags. So Republicans in the Deep South had a higher tendency to be groupie than any of the other regional / political designations. The other thing we looked at Trump voters versus Clinton voters. So we had counties and we did not see a difference between Trump voters and Clinton voters, but the other county, we did 2 county measures. The other county measure we looked at is the decline in jobs from manufacturing. So in a county where there was a greater decline in jobs from manufacturing over the past 10 years, there was a higher tendency to be groupie. So the people who were answering our survey who lived in those counties were more likely to be groupie. Again, okay, we don't know what's going on. It could be that these are people who are attached to place and therefore stayed despite the loss of jobs. Or these are people who, it was just bad, people who are surrounded by bad economic circumstances are more groupie. We don't know, but these are interesting things that we could possibly consider. So I don't have the social, the idea of, I actually realize that's not what I'm presenting next. What I'm presenting next is probably much more interesting. We also have another set of experiments where we introduced information about the other person, and that seemed to break the quote unquote break the groupiness. So we have a similar set of experiments where people are placed into groups and political groups exactly like this. And then in one treatment, they're told a reinforcing bit of information about the group, so an answer about a political position. And in a second treatment, they are told something idiosyncratic about the other person, like I wanted to be an astronaut when I grew up, or I have a dog, or I like pizza with pineapple on it. And we showed that when the idiosyncratic information was presented, we see much less groupie behavior. So this is the social context hypothesis. If you start to introduce this more idiosyncratic information that this person's a real person, they have a family, they have kids, that you see less of the groupie behavior, but you see it in both directions, actually. You see less discrimination against the out group, but you also see less favoritism towards the in group, right? So the two go together, the two merge, they're sort of much closer, but from both ends, right? So there's less favoritism towards the in group, and there's less discrimination against the out group. So that's the result there. But what I'd like to show you next is this another again, we're in the world of inequality here, right? There's an inequality summer school. So this paper, this particular experiment is not mine. Mikhail Bauer and some of his wonderful co-authors, they're looking at explicitly the joy of destruction. So they went right to the point here is like, when do people pay money to destroy somebody else's income? So they didn't have the matrices, right? They just looked at something called the joy of destruction game. And the joy of destruction game is you have two people, each received €2. They can simultaneously each pay 20 cents to reduce the other's income by €1. Okay, so this is just purely pay money, reduce the other person's income. Okay, so it's called the joy of destruction game. And what they were doing was comparing the behavior towards majority or minority co-ethnic counterparts. So again, what you have here is you have two people, and you want to look at my decision when I'm Slovak, right? Versus when I have a Slovak counterpart versus when I have a Roma counterpart. So you have pairs, right? So the Slovak, one is Slovak, one is Slovak Roma. Right. And so what we're worried, the treatment is seeing whether the counterpart is either Slovak or Roma. So majority versus minority. So matches me, I'm the minority, I'm the Slovak. So you understand, so that's the counterpart. The participants were Slovak. The counterpart was either the same or in the other group, Roma. And so the way they were using distance schools, and this is one of the experiments that was exploiting last names as the way of indicating ethnic differences. And what their comparison, what they wanted to understand was, did people change their choices when they observed other people's previous choices, right? So now what they did is they had three participants, each participant had a counterpart. So it's really 6 people, but 3 participants, each participant had a counterpart, right? And what they did is they looked at the 3 participants and saw, when the first participant made a decision, did that affect the second participant or the third participant vis-a-vis their counterparts? And one of these 3 decisions was implemented. Okay, and so the results are really quite stunning. There's a large influence of peers' behavior. So first of all, the first person who was chosen among the 3 movers whether that person was destructive, what they call destructive or peaceful, was uncorrelated with unobserved characteristics. So with observable characteristics. So there was nothing particularly special about the first movers, right? But the first and second movers did influence later choices. So if the first person was destructive, the second person was more likely to be destructive, et cetera. And the second person influenced the third person. But, and here's the key result, right? This influence was more than double when the counterpart was Roma. Okay, so the second decision makers, right, were much more likely, or here, susceptible to follow destructive behavior when the counterpart was Roma, than when the counterpart was Slovak. So here we see, I mean, this is really quite a striking experimental result, and it's getting, closer to those historical examples that I was citing in the very beginning, right? Here we see a setting where you can decide whether or not to pay money to destroy somebody else's money. And people did it, first of all. Not only did they do it, but they followed somebody else in doing so, right? So if somebody else were to act destructively, people were more actively to act destructively themselves, and they were more likely to have this destructive behavior when the person whose income was being destroyed was somebody from the minority group. So this is an illustration, of the type of experimental work that's trying to get at, again, returning to what I said at the very beginning, I'm calling these preferences for inequality. I mean, these people liked, obviously they paid for it. So they paid to be in a position of inequality where, of course, they were ahead and the other person was worse off. Okay, I'm not going to have a chance to tell you about this empirical work on identity. What I've done is I've described for you, I guess I have 2 minutes. What I've described to you is a set of experimental papers that where you're basically exploiting in the lab either a minimal group treatment or an ethnic real group treatment, somehow real group differentiation, and trying to see how people behave vis-a-vis somebody in their group and somebody out of their group. There's also now an emerging work, and I've heard some of it in our chat, right, that we had in the break, about people who are doing empirical work where identity is an important variable. So let me just show you two of my favorites. This is meant for inspiration to go out and find more of these wonderful ways in which to test the influence of identity. So can we observe identity effects in the data? And so I'm just going to tell you about two of them. One is a gender inequality, and one is about ethnic and religious conflict. And of course, this is innovatively exploiting some data sets. Okay, the first one is gender identity and relative income within households. This is looking at income inequality within a household. So this is a test of the idea that there are gender norms in the United States where women should not earn more than men. Though I heard, I talked in the chat about whether this may be different. This could be, ethnicity specific, but overall there's this gender norms that women should not earn more than their husbands. And so looking at US administrative data and US census data, when these folks looked at the distribution of the share of household income earned by the wife, it exhibits a discontinuity at a half, which is an indication of that this gender norm is operative. And when a randomly chosen woman becomes more likely to earn more than a randomly chosen man, marriage rates decline. So women who earn more than men are less likely to get married. So this is a gender inequality finding. Okay, this is about anti-market culture. This is has less explicitly an inequality, in the title, but it is related to overall market, attitudes towards markets. So this is looking at voting patterns and attitudes towards markets. The finding is they relate to pre-World War II Jewish populations in an area in Russia. So this is an experiment that sort of exploits a boundary between a pale of settlement where the Jewish communities lived next to a Catholic community, and in a place where there was no such community, two communities living together. And of course, after World War II, there's no more Jews. So you can see what the history of having these separated communities did. So the hypothesis is that people who lived in these communities developed animosities towards each other and therefore opposite values. So they looked at the region on either side of the Pale of Settlement. And then we look at this well past World War II, and there are differences in the attitudes on different sides of the border. So I'm going to stop. And social groupings, this is where, summary and directions for future research. Social groupings are important features of inequality. The theories, the different kinds of theories will give us different implications for policies. So I just went through those. And I think I'm just going to say there's, the world is yours. You get to go do this amazing work. And I hope some of you work in this area. The theory should develop deeper theory as to how norms categories emerge and evolve. I don't think we have really great theory on that yet. Some we're starting, but we need to, especially like the evolution, how these norms change and evolve over time. Experiments, these field studies, this geographic variation, how do different norms and identity play out in different places? And I just gave you a taste of some of the empirical work which is going on. And again, I know you'll find some amazing natural experiments out there to find some of these exogenous variation in this sort of identity interplay. So I can't wait to see what you do. And I'll see some of you on Thursday, I guess. And that's it. Thank you.